Welcome back, friends. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a developer advocate on the Spring team. Today, we're looking at this blog post on the Spring.io blog that announces the List Crud Repository and friends for Spring Data 3.0. So what we're going to do today is just quickly go through this blog post and look at some of the highlights, and then we'll go to an actual example. We'll build an application that uses the CRUD repository and kind of the features that we had before, and then we'll change over to the List CRUD repository and see how that changes. Now, I will mention up front, this isn't like one of those very huge features, but for me, it's just fixing one of those things that always kind of like irked me, and you'll see what I mean as we get into it. So just hats off to the Spring Data team for taking a look into this, and I know there's some internal debate on how to approach this. So I think the solution they came up with was really awesome. So the Spring Data CRUD repository has various methods that return multiple instances of the entity. So if you ever need to bring back a collection of, say, customers when you're finding all, or when you're find all or find all by ID or save all, those kind of CRUD repository methods always return an iterable. And so in your controller, if you wanted to return that collection, you have to return an iterable, or maybe in your service layer, you did something to turn that into a list. So typically we're used to working with lists, right? I want a list of customers. So having iterables that return type, as pointed out here in the blog post, is kind of annoying. So repositories returning lists. So Spring Data 3.0 is now going to offer a list CRUD repository interface. And so you can see here in the CRUD repository, we have these methods like find all by ID, and save all, and these are all returning an iterable. Well, in the 3.0, in the list CRUD repository, you can see that these return a list. So again, simple change for us, not a huge change, but it's just one of those nice to have convenient things. Now, to make this happen, a couple things went on behind the scenes. The popular paging and sorting repositories used to extend from CRUD repository, but that's no longer going to be the case. And so this lets you combine it with either the CRUD repository or the list CRUD repository. So if you're going to do that, so the paging and sorting repository in version 2.x look like this. Now in 3.x, what you're going to do is you're going to extend both the paging and sorting repository and then whatever CRUD version you want, the CRUD or the list CRUD repository. So then there's some more information in here about that. And then, hey, what if I'm not ready to move to 3.0 yet? What if I'm still on 2.x and I want to fix this? There's some things that you can do to do this. And then just a little history on why Iterable was there in the first place. So I'm going to link to this blog post in the description below. It's worth the read. But what I want to do now is just go through an example of what this looks like. All right, we're going to create our new project by heading over to start.spring.io. We're going to choose Maven and Java. The important part here is we need to choose the Spring Boot 3.0.0 snapshot. This is where those bits and goodies from Spring Data 3 are coming in. So we need to make sure we choose that, or the list CRUD repository interface will not be available. So I'm going to go ahead and choose dev.danvega. We're going to call this artifact Spring 1 tour just because I'm going to be using events and we have a tour coming up to go ahead and list those out. So I'm going to model this around an event class. So we have a Spring 1 tour. Here's our demo project, Java, and we're going to choose Java 17. The dependencies that we're going to use today are going to be the web. We're going to use Spring Data JDBC. The reason for this is I noticed Spring Data JPA is really popular and it's great to use on a number of projects. But I do want to start highlighting Spring Data JDBC a lot more in some future videos, just because I don't think, one, people may not know that it's even there. And two, kind of what are some of the use cases why you would choose JDBC over JPA. So I just want to point that out. I'm going to start using this more. And if you're interested in videos around Spring Data JDBC, please reach out and let me know. So we're also going to need a database. We're just going to use H2. And really that's all we need for this demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and generate this. I will unzip that and open that in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ IDEA. All right, the first thing I'm going to do here is come into my main application class and go ahead and run this and just make sure that everything is working correctly, and it is. Good. So now we can get started. The first class that I'm going to create, I'm going to go in here and create a package called model. And again, we're going to model this after the new Spring 1 tour. We are back, we are in person. And so we're just creating a model of events. And so we're going to call this event. And this is actually not going to be a class. We're actually going to use a record here. So I'm going to have a few properties on here, one of an ID, one of the city that we're visiting. We're going to have the local date for the start date. And then we'll have the local date for the end date. So that's really all we need. For Spring Data, we need to come in here and say which field is the ID. So we're going to annotate this with the @ID annotation. And that's really all we need to do for event. So the next thing that we would do in an application like this is create a new package called repository. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new repository called event repository. And this is going to be an interface. And if you're new to Spring Data, don't worry about this too much. But basically what we do in Spring Data here is we define an interface that extends one of the interfaces in Spring Data. And then at runtime, we get a proxy that has all of the methods that we need to call on it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to extend, and now before the changes that are coming with the list CRUD repository, we would use something called the CRUD repository. So in the CRUD repository, we need to define the entity type. So we're going to say event, and then in that entity type, what is the ID? We're going to go ahead and say long. So there we go. And that's all we need to get some CRUD some CRUD methods out of that. So if we look in here and then kind of look at the structure of this class, we have all of these methods in here that we can call, things like save all, find all by ID. And now remember, things like find all and find all by ID are returning an iterable, and that's important. That's one of the changes that we're going to look at. So now that we have our event model, we have a repository called event repository. Let's take a look at what we need to do now. We need to go into our application.properties here and set up a few properties. Just going to go ahead and copy and paste these in to save some time. Basically, on our data source, we don't want to generate a unique name for the H2 database. We're setting an actual name called the Spring 1 Tour, and we're enabling the H2 console so we could go in and see it. So now the one thing that really kind of stands out that's different than, say, Spring Data JPA is that the Spring Data is not going to create a schema from basically our entities. So the one thing we need to go ahead and provide early on here is a schema so that we have like that event table in our H2 database. So to do so, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to call this schema.sql. And we're just going to go ahead and create a table called event. And that column is going to be called ID. That is going to be identity, not null, and a primary key. We're going to have a city, which is a varchar. We'll just have this in 25. What the heck? We'll make it a little longer just for... We're going to have a field called start date. And this will be a date, whoops, and then we'll have an end date, and this will be a date. So that looks good for the schema. We have our properties set for the database. One last thing we need to do is we need to go into our main application class here, and we need to enable JDBC repositories. If you're new to Spring Data JDBC, this is right in the documentation. We need to go in and say, hey, this is will enable JDBC repositories. So now Spring will go ahead and scan the package of the annotated configuration class for any repositories by default. So this is really what kind of kicks that off. So what we're going to do now is just rerun this application and head over to the browser. Oh, we have an error here. Let's see, syntax error. There seems to be an issue with our SQL. Do we just not like that? Let's try and run that again. Okay, and that works. So let's head over to the browser. I'm going to go to localhost 8080, and of course we don't have any mappings here, but we do have an H2 console. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. The JDBC URL you can see here. If you're ever unsure of what this is, if you go back here, you should be able to see this in the logs. So H2 console is available here. Database is available here. So you can just copy that path into here. So the default username is going to be SA, and there is no password. You can always test this, but we're going to connect. And now we see our event table, but there is no data in it. So let's go ahead and correct that. So here in my main application class, I'm going to go ahead and create a new bean. We'll call this public application runner. And inside of here, we're going to create some new data. Again, application runner, if you're not familiar, is a functional interface, has a single method called run, which takes some application arguments. We don't need any of these arguments now. So in turn, you could probably use a command line runner for this too, but no worries. Again, because this is a functional interface, we can use a lambda here. So we're going to say return args. And inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and use the repository that we created over here. So the event repository. So to do so, I'm going to add an argument here called event repository. And I'm going to say event repository dot save. And we're going to say new event. And we need to pass in some parameters here. Now, the ID of the event, remember, we said in our schema that that was going to be generated by the database. So we're just going to pass in null. The city is going to be Chicago. That is the first stop of our Spring 1 tour, and that is going to happen on liquidate.of, and we're going to say 2022 4/26. And I'm already starting to see this. Let's go ahead and put these on separate lines. This will help. And the end date is going to be 4/27. So that should satisfy that. So again, we're using the event repository, the save method. This comes when you extend the CRUD repository. There's a save method in the CRUD repository, which just takes an entity. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And to do so, we're going to go ahead and rerun our application. And because we turned on some debugging in our application.properties, you can see that it executed the SQL statement insert into event with those, the city, end date, and start date. So if we go back to our browser and log into our H2 database, we should see from the event, we have a single event in there. So that's great. Now, when we come back and we want to, say, create a controller, let's go ahead and create a controller, and we'll call this package controller, and we'll create a new class in here called the event controller. And this is going to be a REST controller with the request mapping of events. And I'll create a get mapping. And we basically want to return a list of event, and we'll say this is called find all, And let's just return null for now. So I needed an instance of my repository in there. I'll say event repository will get an instance of this through constructor injection. Now, if you're new to Spring and dependency injection, I'm going to go ahead and link to a video that I've done recently on constructor injection and why it's the preferred method when it comes to dependency injection. So if you're interested in that, I'll go ahead and link that above and below. So check that out. So now that we got an instance of our repository, we would want to say, hey, repository.findAll. But as you know, looking at that CRUD repository, we're going to have a mismatch here. It's going to say, hey, you are trying to return a list of events, but what you actually are returning is an iterable of events. So sure, you could fix this and say iterable, and everything would work out. But what if I wanted a list here? What if in my service method, I was doing something with that list and I returned a list from my service method? Then in my service method, I'd have to somehow take that iterable and turn it into a list. When most of the time we're just, especially when we're returning a collection of things, we're used to working with a list of things. So again, go back to that blog post to kind of get the motivation behind this, but that's it. So let's go back to our repository, and instead of using the CRUD repository, we're going to use this list CRUD repository. So now we import that. If we take a look at this, there's only 3 methods in here, which is the save all. So this now returns a list, find all now returns a list, and find all by ID now returns a list. Now you still get all of the methods from the CRUD repository because list CRUD repository extends from that. So now if we go back to our controller, you can see that everything works out. If we want to, we can go ahead and rerun this. And if I'm back in the browser here and I just want to go ahead and check out events, you can see that that returns an array of objects, so an array of events more specifically, and we just have the one in the database, so it returns that one. So I think, just to kind of talk about something else here, if you are going to use the paging and sorting repositories, if you need paging or if you need sorting, this is something that you have to remember. So if you're going to come in here and say, I want to use paging and sorting, again, you're going to have to give it a type. Again, you're going to have to give it an ID. So this is just something to remember. The paging and sorting repository extends repository. It does not extend the CRUD repository. So you're not getting those CRUD methods by default. If you need to come in here and say CRUD repository or list CRUD repository. And again, give it a type and give it an ID. And now you'll kind of get back to the functionality that was in the 2.x line. So I like this. Again, simple change for just wanting to be able to return a list of something. But I think it's a really great one, and it just kind of simplifies things. I know this bit me as a beginner, and I know I get a lot of questions about this in both my videos and my courses on why it can't be a list. So going forward, now it can. Just remember that this is in a snapshot. I'm using Spring Boot 3 snapshots. So if you're doing a demo and you want to check this out, make sure you're doing the same. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and call it today. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in more videos on Spring Data JDBC, I know I am. Tell me what you're looking for on that front, and I'll go ahead and get something out on that. And I hope you found some value in this video. If you really enjoyed it, what would really help me out, and it helps the algorithm out and helps other people discover this channel, is if you could just leave a thumbs up, maybe leave a comment below and tell me what you like or didn't like about this video or any questions you have about it. Those kind of interactions really help me and the channel out. So I hope you enjoyed this. And as always, friends, happy coding.